The Blu-ray label that began all of this for me many years ago is Eureka Entertainment. They were there before Criterion was there for me, before I started collecting 4Ks and Arrow Video and Indicator. It was Eureka with their Masters of Cinema line. That was how I discovered so many great world cinema classics, and it was a real education for me. Recently, they have been releasing some truly excellent stuff that has been opening my mind to parts of cinema that I hadn't even thought of really before. And I have a few new titles that I'm adding to my collection, which I'm going to show you in this video. In a recent video where I talked about what I was watching lately, I mentioned Odd Couple. Now, this is a martial arts Hong Kong cinema film, and that is an area of the world and a type of film that I hadn't really been acquainted with all that much. But this film I completely loved, and it has sparked this passion for this new area of cinema. Now, I'm not talking about this one here because I've already talked about it, but I have received 2 new titles in this vein from Eureka. I have Knockabout, and I also have Dreadnought. So I watched these 2 films during the last few days, and this is continuing the streak of great martial arts films that I never even knew existed, that I now really, really love. I'll talk about these separately in a minute, but what I am loving about this type of filmmaking that was going on in Hong Kong and in the martial arts scene at the time is a real sense of fun in the filmmaking. Like, I have so much fun watching these films, and it feels like they would have been fun to make, but obviously very difficult because of all the choreography and the extravagant sets and costumes, you know, stuff like that. What I am also really enjoying about these type of films is the blending of different genres. So obviously you have the martial arts choreography as the baseline, but within the stories that are being told, you have a lot of comedy. The characters are quite comedic, and just the way they interact with each other is light-hearted and funny. They can also tackle serious issues as well, and they even delve into the realm of horror. I'll just talk a bit about this one, Dreadnought, because I think this is my favourite of the 3 films that I have watched thus far. This one has so many amazing things going on in it. The performers are great, and of course the action sequences are great as well. But there's this really interesting scene with the traditional lion dances, and the amount of choreography and just sheer creativity going into this particular scene is just mind-blowing. So if you watch this film, you'll know the scene that I mean. That scene is actually what's being depicted here on the front of the artwork. And speaking of the artwork, I'm really enjoying the design of these releases. I'm someone who has tried not to be obsessed with slipcovers in the past, and now I don't really care all too much about collecting slipcovers. But I must say that the slipcovers on these Eureka releases are probably the best slipcovers around. They feel very nice, they look very nice, and they are providing alternate artwork than what is on the case. Although this case does have a reversible sleeve that will show this artwork. Even though I said Dreadnought was my favourite, I really had a great time with Knockabout, which is about these 2 guys who are local con men, and they get beaten by this martial arts master, so they decide that they need to train up so that they can defend themselves when they need to. And it's a great film which goes in so many different directions. There are some interesting tonal shifts in this film. And again, I'm just so impressed with the style of filmmaking and everything that goes into making this kind of film. I don't even know where I would start if I was to try and make a film like this. You do get a ton of special features on these releases as well, and I particularly enjoyed listening to the audio commentaries by Frank Jeng and Michael Worth. They are definitely worth going into because those guys seem like they know an awful lot about this type of cinema, something that I know very little about. So those proved to be very educational and enjoyable indeed. Moving on from the martial arts films, Another thing that I picked up from Eureka is the 3 monster tales of sci-fi terror. These are Universal monster movies in the vein of Frankenstein and Dracula, although obviously not as well known. Frankly, these are films that I hadn't even heard about before watching this release. And I must admit, they're not as great as the greats from Universal, like I mentioned, Frankenstein and Dracula. But they are very interesting to watch, sort of as a companion piece to those films. So these aren't the type of movies that are going to blow you away necessarily, but if you're interested in monster movies and the history of horror movies, these are definitely worth checking out. And of course, the special features really do provide extra context into these films and when they were made, how they were marketed, etc. The first film in this set, Man-Made Monster, was the one I was particularly interested in because of Lon Chaney Jr., who of course is an icon of classic horror movies. Again, I must say that the packaging and the slipcover is all very nice on this release. You can tell a lot of care went into it from Eureka. So overall, I was very pleased with this release. It isn't one for the novice to the classic horror genre. I don't think you're going to get too much from it if you're not very familiar with those classic Universal monster movies. But if you are, then there's a lot to sink your teeth into in this release. Another one added to the collection from Eureka is Midnight. This is a South Korean thriller that was only released last year, so this is a brand new movie. This is part of Eureka's Montage line, so that's their sub-label where they put a real focus on modern world cinema and shining a light on films that you probably wouldn't have heard of. This was one that I hadn't really heard of, so I'm thankful for them for kind of shining a light, as I said, on these kind of films. So the film is a serial killer thriller, very much a cat and mouse type of film, with the interesting device, which is that 2 of the main protagonists cannot hear the killer because they are deaf. So there is some interesting stuff being done there, but I must say that the film didn't really do all that much for me. I thought that on a content level, the story was quite interesting, even if it went a bit wacky at times. But where it was let down in my eyes was with the form, so the direction, the cinematography, the sound design, all of that stuff did not really elevate the material that was there. So it kind of felt quite run-of-the-mill, the kind of things that, you know, we see all across streaming services and things like that. That's just my opinion though. I think if you're a fan of modern South Korean cinema and if you're a fan of serial killer stories, you might really get a lot out of this. It just wasn't really one for me. I must say, however, that there is an audio commentary with my favourite, Kat Ellinger, where she's going into the history of this type of film in Korea and just this kind of serial killer story and providing extra context and all that good stuff that we come to know from her style of commentary. I had the commentary on in the background after watching this all the way through, and I gotta say, I think the commentary I enjoyed even more than the movie itself, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That's just how good Kat's commentaries are. Again, you got a great slipcover from Eureka, and there's the montage cover artwork underneath. So if you're a fan of South Korean cinema and serial killer stories, this could be one for you. So these were the Eureka titles added to my collection recently. Speaking of my collecting habits, if you want to see what my top 10 boutique Blu-rays of last year were, then just click the video on screen now. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be back soon, so stay well, keep watching great films.